So our first session today, or after lunch, is Hayden McGowan from the University of Ottawa, who just disappeared. Oh no, there it is. And he's going to talk to us about Barry Truax's Riverrun. So, welcome. Beautiful.
Thank you very much. I wrote a paper called Teleology and Unity in Barry Truax's Riverrun. So just to briefly go over what we're going to talk about. I'm also going to say that paper, you may have noticed in the proceedings, it's quite brief. The presentation will also be quite brief, so I expect that I might end a bit early. We're just going to start with a quick introduction of the paper, and I'm going to talk about the piece a little bit for those who aren't familiar with it, and then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the paper. I'm going to debrief the paper, a little conclusion, and then let you know what my next steps are for further research, and hopefully some questions. Barry Truax's Riverrun, it's one of those pieces that it's generally remembered for one main reason, which is just that it was the first piece to implement real-time granular synthesis in its composition back in 1986. So this was a big moment. Granular synthesis was hypothesized. It was implemented a little bit, not in real time by Curtis and some others. But this was the first time that real-time granular synthesis was used using the DMX-1000 digital signal processor. A lot of the literature around this piece deals with that subject, the actual granular synthesis aspect. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about the success of the piece that reaches beyond just the mechanics of the sound world. So beyond just the process of the technology. And I do so by talking about the integration of the soundscape and narrative in the piece. And how it's really lovely, satisfying, pathetic hearing, and I'll explain that a little bit later. So the actual narrative of Riverrun piece it's the journey of water. It's flowing from a trickling stream all the way to this. And I'll just read a little quote that Barry wrote that was written. So he says that Riverrun modeled itself, as the title suggests, on the flow of a river from the smallest droplets or grains are what represent the droplets, to the magnificence of rivers that are sometimes very frightening. They cut through mountains, they have huge cataracts, and they eventually arrive at the sea, end quote. This narrative inherent telos, a narrative telos, which I'll explain shortly. And it's realized in an integrated way with the soundscape through a micro and macrostructural uniformity in the sound world and the overall form. And of course, the consistent use of contextually appropriate sound materials. That last bit actually deals with some of the work that Curtis Rhodes did just last year with at the last KEAMSAC conference as the keynote, I believe. And that's kind of where some of these ideas started for me was with Curtis's paper on musical narrative and contextual sound objects. So just a little bit of background on Riverrun and Barry Truax. Barry is a Canadian composer. I'm also from Canada, so I have a bit of an interest in that naturally. He's a professor emeritus at Simon Fraser University. He was a pretty big proponent, and still is, of granular synthesis, especially in the 1980s. Computer music composer, acoustic composer, like I said, the significance of this piece in particular, this was probably his most famous piece, was the implementation of real-time granular synthesis for the first time. And I actually already discussed the narrative, so I think we'll just skip over that for now. Moving on to teleology. So a little bit of foreshadowing, I guess, in the previous presentation by Ian with the concept of teleology. So teleology, for those who aren't familiar with the concept, it's a philosophical idea, an old philosophical idea, concerned with telos. So telos is something's purpose, its end, its reason for being. The classic example of Aristotle is the acorn. So an acorn has as its telos becoming an oak tree. That's its reason for being. So this concept is controversial in a lot of contemporary philosophy. Has been from that's only just because it conflicts with a lot of scientific axioms that we now accept to be largely true. So, for example, in the natural sciences, evolutionary biology, for instance. This idea of nature having some sort of ultimate goal, it conflicts with the idea that a lot of evolutionary mechanics are chance-based with mutations and such. So this concept is controversial in these contexts, but I argue that in aesthetic arguments, reappropriating these teleological ideas don't necessarily elicit those same criticisms, just because it's so far removed from the science and the metaphysics and those kinds of issues. So teleology and Riverrun. I'm just going to start this by saying many pieces of music have narrative telic elements. So this is not unique in any way, in any meaningful way. And of course, many analytical models of music are also end-oriented, so my ideas here aren't necessarily new either. What's different about Riverrun, what's different about my ideas is that this musical telos in Riverrun is realized the component of narrative in the sound world. And I'm going to talk about that a little more soon, but before I do that, I just explicitly that Riverrun, as a narrative, has a telos arrival at the ocean. So as I described before, and here's that very Truax quote again, the piece starts by trying to represent water droplets, very small water droplets, and eventually the water, it goes on a long journey from river to river. There are some points where the water is vast, some points where it tightens up a little bit, and eventually it reaches the sea. So the arrival at the ocean is the telic implication that at some point the water does stop running, and it will arrive at this vast body of water. I'm just going to play a little excerpt. Hopefully the audio works. If you're not getting any sound, just stop me and let me know. But I'm going to try to just play a little clip here. This is just the first few minutes of Riverrun. Is the audio playing?
You're downloading still, but
Yeah.
it's very slow.
Okay, you know what? We can just move on. I think that's taking too long.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I suppose if anyone's interested, you can just you can find the piece on YouTube
Yeah.
after I'm finished. So you'll have to use your imagination. So if I could maybe just describe the piece a little bit in terms of how it sounds. So granular synthesis kind of creates these very small sonic objects. So familiar with the process, you basically take a signal, a sample, and you kind of explode it into many parts. So this could be like dozens of grains, hundreds of grains sometimes. They're very tiny little sound objects that emerge from the source material. And the result in this piece with Barry's use of is a sort of collection of tiny grains just kind of blipping and blooping, blip, 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 all moving around like that. And the result is meant to sound like water droplets. I'm going to move on. Sorry about that. It took a long time to figure that out. So yeah, now that we've established the teleological elements of the piece, I guess what I'm going to talk about is how this telos is realized through uniformity and unity in the work. So unity contributes significantly to the meaningful realization of this telic narrative. So in other words, in order for this narrative, the telos to be realized to that endpoint, to get to that ocean, the only meaningful way to achieve that is to make the listener feel as though they're actually in the narrative, they're actually in the sound world. And so contextually appropriate sound objects is important for that reason. In other words, it's not enough directly if what we really want is a journey from this trickling river, trickling stream all the way to the vast ocean, if that's what we want. So for abstract sonic contents to migrate from some kind of defined point A to a defined point B, that would just be very disconnected from the narrative material. So rather, the telos must be realized in the context of the narrative with contextualized sonic concepts. And this is achieved through approximate and consistent sonic representations of water, whether realistically represented or defined as such through repetition. So yeah, here's where Curtis Rhodes factors in. So this was his paper, "What is Sonic Narrative?" from last year's conference. And here's a little quote just about this sort of contextually appropriate idea. "Only a contextually appropriate sound serves a narrative structure. Appropriate sound objects and dangling phrases inserted into context work against their surroundings. If they are not pruned out of the composition, their presence weakens the structural integrity of the piece. Even a small anomaly of this kind can loom large in the mind of listeners. An inappropriate sound object or phrase can cancel out the effect of surrounding phrases or call into question the effectiveness of an entire position," end quote. So in other words, the efficacy of a musical narrative can become compromised by the presence of inappropriate sound objects, or sound objects that are not contextually appropriate to the purpose that they're trying to serve. In this case, the representation of water. So the efficacy of the Riverrun's narrative, and thus the realization of its telos, can in part be attributed to the appropriateness of its sonic contents, and the relevance of that material to the narrative. And in this regard, the meaningful realization of this telic narrative, in fact, necessitates the ubiquity of contextually appropriate sound objects. Because like we said before, if there's a defined point A and a defined point B, they're totally abstract, and the sound objects don't relate to each other in any meaningful way, don't relate to the narrative in any meaningful way, then we can't expect to realize such a specific telic narrative, the journey of water. We can't expect that to come across in any kind of meaningful way. So in other words, the narrative can only really be realized teleologically through the use of contextually appropriate sound objects. Luckily for Barry, granular synthesis is well suited to the emulation of natural sounds. His granular processor, the DMX1000, allows controlled parametric randomization, a component that approximates the randomness of real water sounds. In other words, the randomization element that's afforded by this granular synthesis technique, you can imagine if you enter in a sine wave that's middle C, and you're just playing middle C on a sine wave. If you pass that through this digital signal processor and with the granular processor, you can actually say, okay, within this time frame, let's say 50 milliseconds, I want to hear, let's say, a dozen different notes that are around middle C. So it randomizes a given octave, for example. It can be larger than an octave. But what you get is, instead of middle C over and over again, the little tiny branch just going middle C, middle C, middle C over and over again, you instead get a wide range of frequencies. So I equate that in my paper using the analogy of turning on the water in your shower. So when you turn on the water in your shower, let me just go to that point in my paper here, 1 second. The water in the shower will produce minutely different sonic results each time. So the water that's coming out of the shower head will bounce off of the floor at different angles. The density of its flow will vary subtly. But the extent of that differentiation is limited by the actual shower mechanism and the plumbing in the bathroom and the shape of the tub and that sort of thing. So this is very similar to how parametric randomization works in granular synthesis. You get a sort of defined set of parameters within which randomization can occur, but it can only occur so much. It can't really extend beyond that. So it's very similar. And in that sense, as Helmuth and Truax, as you see here, I've quoted in my paper, they both point out that granular synthesis is very well suited to the randomization of, or to the stochastic components of real world sounds. So, for example, to approximate the sound of a trickling rivulet at the beginning of the piece, a very small stream, Truax defines a wide frequency randomization profile. So, in other words, a whole bunch of different frequency, a whole bunch of different notes are possible for very small little sounds. And I was going to play an audio excerpt for you, but unfortunately we can't do that now. Whereas for more powerful bodies of water, like let's say once the water from the stream reached a big river at around 7 minutes, but again, we can't listen to it, the randomization is increased in both frequency and grain duration as the grain density proliferates. So in other words, it's becoming more and more in flux and more intense, and the grain density becomes higher and higher. So what we're really dealing with is sound world, the narrative that the actual system that's used to generate the sound world is perfectly in tune with it. And it results in a piece that really is fully viable. So moving on, the uniformity of ungranulated source material, sine and FM waves, contributes further to the sense of unity in the piece. So all sound sources in this piece come from sine or FM waves. So there are no saw waves, there's no audio samples, nothing like that. It's just sine and FM waves. And since they're processed granularly, it's not necessarily discernible by the listener that these are sine or FM waves. So you wouldn't be able to sit someone down and have them listen to the piece and say, oh well, are you able to tell that this is all the same sonic material that's being granularized? And yeah, they wouldn't be able to do that. But if these waveforms were to be replaced occasionally with saw waves, for example, or square waves, the difference in the output would be immediately apparent. So the relevance of those sounds, if they were saw or square waves every once in a while, as well as their relationship to the piece at large, would be called into question because they're not contextually appropriate. We've defined what's supposed to sound like water. We've defined what's contextually appropriate, which is a sine or FM wave. And then if you break that, which Barry doesn't do, you would be entering the world of abstract sonic materials. And that's not the case. So the listener is led to believe that in the piece, oh, sorry, actually I just explained that. We'll skip that. And yes, so the uniformity of this source material creates an in-world criterion, a defined criterion for sonic. And so this sonic microstructure, the waveform, relates to the macrostructure or the narrative form, and in a way that is, it's so deeply integrated to the fabric of the work itself, the narrative and everything else, that they're almost indistinguishable. The narrative and the sound world are so tightly construed that they actually become one. And I think that's really the effectiveness of the piece. I realize that I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to go as quickly as I can through this last point. So Riverrun sound world, it never enters a state of rest. It's in a constant state of flux. There's always something moving, always something happening. And the poetics of motion that are embedded in the imagery of flowing bodies of water necessitates this sense of motion. Another aspect of the piece, which is so deeply integrated with the narrative. Throughout the piece, and particularly in sections where the grain density is high, grains are constantly adopting new pitch values and durations at a dizzying pace. Yet, the perpetuity of the rapid motion results in the perceived stasis. So the perpetual motion is so integral to the fabric of the work that the dynamism and rate at which things are changing, it becomes so normalized that you feel as though it's static. And I feel as though by the end of the piece, when you reach the ocean, I think that's really how that would feel, is that there's so much moving, there's so much water moving around you in a vast body of water like the ocean that you do feel like it's just normalized, it's just a state of flux that is natural. So I'm just going to read this out to you. Truax's achievement of successfully implementing real-time granular synthesis, important milestone in development electro-acoustic true. However, implementation of technique does not immediately result in successful music by default. This is not to suggest that Riverrun's compositional success is entirely separate from its technological ingenuity, but instead to draw attention to Truax's impressive integration of a teal narrative with a contextually appropriate and unified sound world. Rather than break it down to get a lot aspect, Truax narrative and allows the contents of the sound. And quickly, my final thoughts. As I said earlier, the tealic aspects that I'm talking about, they appear in all kinds of music, especially programmatic music, and end-oriented analytical models are not new either. Schenkerian analysis, for example, is definitely tealic, and a lot of common practice harmony is tealic. But considering musical concept some new ideas of analytical theory, I don't think, from what I've from my research, it hasn't been talked about. So I'm glad that I'm talking about it. And I think I'll just leave you with that. So I welcome your questions. Sorry for going over time, and sorry that we didn't have any audio examples, but if anyone has any questions, take them.
Great, thanks. Anyone have any questions? Anybody who's present have a question? How about any of our virtual participants? Would anybody like to ask a question? I don't think the lack of questions reflects a lack of interest. I think it's just so neatly contained, and it's wonderful that you treat this piece not just as a piece that's historically important, but as a piece that's aesthetically sound and pleasurable to listen to as a actual finished work of music. So, which is, I think, very useful that we forget. We forget sometimes that this stuff is supposed to be music, right? That it's supposed to be aesthetic. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider the actual fabric of the music. So I appreciate your talk very much.